I bet you've already played around with some sounds and ideas. I definitely have. Now it's time to get out of the loop and arrange those ideas to finished songs. Melodic techno producer Dahu will share proven methods, show you how to keep tension and release going over a complete track, and how you improve your drops. I can't wait, so let's go.
Welcome everyone to the arrangement leg of our course. My name is Dahu. You might know me from my tracks released primarily on the Berlin label Radikon. And I'm taking you through my thoughts on arrangement today. Basically, how do I go about arranging a track from an idea to, a finished product? What parts in that process I focus on, and things like building energy progression, identifying focal elements and make those carry your track, and also introducing dynamics without having the track be overloaded. All right. Welcome everyone to the arrangement leg of our course. My name is Dahu. You might already know me from my productions released primarily on the Berlin label Radikon or from other videos I've done for Production Music Live. And today we are talking about what is to me one of the most difficult concepts or parts of the production process, which is the arrangement. And I know that a lot of people struggle with it. If you're like me, you have tons of 16, 32 bar loops on your hard drive, and turning that into full-blown tracks is kind of where a lot of the ideas get lost, and I'm going to expand on why I think that is in a little bit, but for now let's look at the setup we're going to be working with here. So basically I've taken the full PML track Ignite that you can download over on Production Music Live, so you can also work along with this project, and I've deleted the entire arrangement here, so we have a blank slate to work with, and split it into a couple of stems here. So we have kick, bass, drums, synths, and then we have bank 1, bank 2, which I've muted for now because those are kind of the sounds in the Ignite project that we wouldn't usually have in our jam stage when we start arranging the track, like risers, pads, stuff like that. That comes a little bit later in our process, so I've just left those off for now. So before we go into the whole thing, let's listen to what we have here. So we have kind of a fast-paced melodic techno track here, 16th note bass, staccato, kind of up-tempo, high energy, and then we have a couple of synths here. And I've just quickly highlighted this pitch bendy sound that I've called the main lead, because I think this is the energetic focal point of the track, the element that has the highest amount of energy. So when I start the arrangement process, I kind of like to pick out one element that I think, okay, like this is what's going to carry the track. This should be at the highest energetic point of the track, and the other elements should, support this element in shining and bringing out its energetic qualities in the best way possible. Just wanted to highlight that quickly. And then we have these plucks, which are kind of like a counterpart to this kind of tearing, pitch bendy lead. And then we have two kind of supporting lead sounds a little bit. So right now it's kind of busy, but loops are often kind of busy, and we're going to have to find a way in the arrangement to make sure that there's different methods to make sure that each element, carries its own weight. Like we can use call and response and other techniques, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So this is our basic setup. I wanted to replicate a situation a lot of producers have on the daily. I also have on the daily, and I think this is a pretty good way to achieve that. But before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about why I think a lot of people struggle with arrangement and what I've learned over 10 years of music production, my own arrangement process. And it's actually been quite the learning curve. I think arrangement is harder to learn for a very specific reason. I mean, a lot of us became producers for the no rules, exploratory fun in bending sounds, and basically kind of that exhilaration that you get in designing sounds and seeing what machines can do and coming up with, your own kind of aesthetics. And in a way, that's what makes production great. And, that free-form flow of ideas in the jam process. But everything, like the mindset that you need to achieve that is exactly the mindset that makes it really hard to produce a good arrangement. And there's a literary quote that sums this up for me pretty well, which is you're supposed to write drunk and edit sober. Now, I'm not advocating for anyone to produce drunk, but I think the metaphor still holds here. Like when you're coming up with ideas, a structure is actually something that will make you like conform too much, that'll make your music be like unsurprising and predictable. So it's a good thing in that stage of production to just like let your ideas flow freely. And I think a lot of producers carry over that feeling into the arrangement process. So while they're arranging a track, they're still adding new channels, they're still, exploring sounds. And I did that too for many, many years. And the problem is if you do this, you lose the energy or whatever it was that was special about your loop to begin with. More and more, you kind of muddy the waters and you end up with like this Frankenstein track that has new ideas coming in, going out at different points. And I think the way to streamline your arrangement and make sure the arrangement captures the energy that you had in your original loop is to be super strict and super structured with yourself and basically edit sober in the arrangement process. And how I personally do that is I just limit myself very rigorously to what I have in the arrangement process. So this means I basically say kick, bass, drum, synths, everything I have in these channels, this is what is going to constitute my final track. I will not open new channels, drop in new synths, explore new sounds, but I will focus my effort on making everything that I already have gel together and work to make sure I have a cohesive arrangement in the end that isn't like all over the place and that really supports the energy that I had to begin with. I just wanted to preface this whole course with that thought because that informs everything I say about arrangement. Stay focused, work with what you have, and don't get sidetracked into new ideas and produce these, kind of Frankenstein tracks that end up being just a pile of sounds in the end. Now that we're in a super laser-focused arrangement mindset, let's talk about the steps we have to take in this project to turn these 32 bar loops into a finished track. And first, we have to come up with a superstructure, which is just a super rough outline of what our energy progression and track will look like. There's a few different methods of achieving this that all have kind of their own pros and cons, so we'll look at that. Then we'll talk about what elements that superstructure needs to contain, especially melodic techno, so the intro, the outro, the all-important break and drop, and what I like to call the groove section, which is basically a minimalistic dance floor focused part that I think especially club focused melodic techno needs to contain. Then we'll be talking about energy progression today, which is super important, not only how you arrange the elements, how you tease them, how you make sure that they naturally flow into the energy progression of the track, but also how on the micro level they are introduced. A lot of arrangements are just channel stacking, so you'll have an element just statically come in at a certain point. And I feel like a lot of people lose a lot of potential energy they could have brought by not introducing or exiting elements properly. I think elements can hit much, much harder, if this is done properly. So we're going to talk about a little bit about my techniques that I use to do that. I use a lot of resampling, but more on that later. And then we'll also talk about ways to make your energy progression flow without constantly having to introduce and exit elements. I feel like a lot of people, or a common problem with arrangement is also that people do too much. They feel like the track is too static, and the only way out of that is to constantly, introduce or exit elements, which especially in the club context makes it super busy, since tracks, basically sound much more busy in the club than in the studio, since you have much more, neurological activity, much more to process, whereas in the studio, all you're listening to is the track, so things can sound static very quickly. But we're going to talk about techniques to get out of that, to make sure, especially your groove and run focused elements have significant energy progression by themselves on like a very almost subconscious level, to make sure you don't feel the need to make your arrangements super busy. So the first thing I want to go in here is kind of 3 easy ways to make a superstructure. So we're not going into the details here. We just want to have scaffolding up to make sure we know where our energy progression is going, and we can start building our energy, our melodic progressions within that framework. Okay, the first thing we have to do here is basically create the canvas on which we're gonna paint later on, and make a very, very rough superstructure here that allows us to work with our project. Now, we're not going to worry about transitions transitions, risers, impacts, stuff like that. All we're trying to do here is take the stems that we have and get them into an energetically logical sequence that we can then work with and make a pop later on. This should not be a part that you spend a lot of time on in your arrangement process. This should be focused on a quick result, and all we want to do here is create a framework that works for us that we can then work within. So we're going to move to the arrangement view here, and I've already dragged all of these stems that we have in here. And a common thing that I see that I don't think benefits a lot of people is arranging from left to right and basically producing the full track from left to right. So when you're worrying about the intro, you're already putting in a riser, you're already filtering, putting in automation and stuff like that. Again, that's kind of like putting the finishing touches on a painting on one half of the canvas when the other one isn't even, roughly outlined yet. And I think that leads to a lot of extra work, and also, again, to losing your way a bit, because melodic techno is focused on the break and the drop. That is the core. Everything before and after is supposed to warm up and cool down to that moment. So you need to have the full structure of the track in place before you get into like the details. And there's a couple of ways to really very quickly draw up these structures. And the most common that people use, I would say, is the additive method, where you're basically just starting with the elements that you're assuming are going to run throughout the track or for most of the track. And you're just going to, for example, start with kick, rolling bass, and then at some point you're going to add, let me just open this up here, add the claps perhaps in a way that makes sense to you. Oh, one thing actually that I forgot to do here that you should always do in the beginning, pull your sidechain channel all the way to the end of the track, because that'll just, you don't want to be mixing. If I heard this clap just now, I would have said, okay, the claps are way too loud, and then turn them down or maybe change an EQ about them or something. That's already getting into details. That's exactly what you shouldn't be doing in arrangement, but it was just so obviously loud. But make sure you have the sidechain running so you don't produce your full track with it off or whatever. There we go, much better. And we'll basically build a structure like this that makes sense to us progressively throughout the track. Now, I think this method has one major fallacy, which is that our brains work in a way that like an up in energy. That's where, in the 60s and 70s, the entire compression war came from, tracks trying to sound louder than everything else, because that automatically means our brains perceive them as better somehow. And energy progression suffers from the same problem. So if you're upping the energy, your brain will automatically have a positive bias toward it. So I really like a very slight variation, which is also channel stacking, but instead of adding, you're subtracting. So subtraction means we're starting with the whole shebang. Let me just go back to where we started here, pull the sidechain, and we're gonna take all of the channels that we have, here we go, and we're gonna just pull them through the full length of the track. Need to copy paste a few things here to make it work. And what we're basically doing here now is, again, channel stacking, but going from the top down to remove that fallacy and identify problems by removing that positive bias that we have towards adding elements. I mean, obviously in the beginning, in warm-up, we can just remove a bunch of elements. So it's completely obvious to me at this point, that this element really sticks out negatively to me now. These two elements together, these stick out negatively to me at this point. They're way too forward for that point in the track, so I'm just gonna delete them here. And I think this is a perfect example for something that I might not have caught if I had just started adding elements. Yeah, this is how, in my opinion, the track should start out. So these two basses, I might have just added them on top if I'd used the additive method, but here it was very obvious to me that energetically I did not like them at that point. That basically illustrates why I suggest you do the subtractive arrangement instead. But again, our plan here is to arrange very roughly the full track, carve out a part about 3 minutes in or something like that for the break, and, progressively just have a very rough draft of what's gonna happen. Okay, one other thing I'm going to do here that I, wanted to talk about later, but, this is a pretty good point to mention it, is I really like to have an element that's first appearance, and in this case, it's even the most energetic element that I want to focus the whole track on, is after the break. That makes it the highest impact moment of the track to really bring in a completely new element. So probably if I was arranging this track, I'd immediately make sure the earliest this element comes in is actually at the highest energy point in the track. But these are like the kind of decisions that I'm talking about in this case, like not in-depth transitions, risers, stuff like that, pads, melodic progression. We're not worrying about anything like that. We're worrying about where do we want elements to land. And for the super high energy element, I would pick here the highest energy point in the track. All right, there is also a third way of arranging here that I want to talk about quickly. So for that, we're going to go back into the session view. We have to delete everything first to make it work. So while out of additive and subtractive, I would definitely recommend you arrange with a subtractive method. There's also live arrangement, basically, where all we do is hit record and then just manually launch clips. Now, this depends a little bit on how many stems you have. I really like this if we can make it work, but here we almost have too many channels to really organize this properly, because we would have to launch elements together, and that doesn't really work. So if you have a track with just a few channels, I would really recommend trying to arrange it in the live mode. So basically just hit record up here and just launch channels in the live format. And then basically all we do is hit record, and we're going to start with kick and rolling bass. Yeah, again, this technique I think is really helpful in getting your own personal fingerprint onto the arrangement. Like, you might need a couple of do-overs to get this right, but it's a quick technique, Basically, you can arrange a 6-minute track in 6 minutes. It's definitely much more usable if you're the kind of producer who has only a few stems. If you have a lot of stems to manage, I would recommend the subtractive method, because that also really helps. If you have a lot of stems, a lot of channels, that helps the misplaced channels energetically stand out much more. But yeah, if you only have a few channels, then I think the most direct way to get your aesthetic into the arrangement of the track is to just live record it. One final thing you can do, or that you can do regardless of the situation, but also if you're stuck, for example, is simply to enter an audio channel and just drop a track into it where you really like the arrangement. And you get immediate visual feedback here once it's loaded. Let's see. All right, you get immediate visual feedback here. You can drag it up a little bit to see, at which point the bass is removed and stuff like that. I mean, if you're struggling, you can definitely take a track that you really enjoy the energy progression in to see how that's actually done on the macro level, and completely orient your stems according, like on the macro level, build your stems according to a track you really like. This is super helpful in understanding how artists that you really enjoy personally, manage their energy, manage their tracks, and it's a great place to start out if you're struggling, but also if you just want to incorporate new ideas that other people are using within their arrangements. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the building blocks that will make up our track, kind of like as a way to have a mind map of what we're doing. And for each part, kind of how I go about, or what the thought process is in developing those building blocks and what goes into them. I've now very rudimentarily arranged this track. Again, at this point, we're not focusing on transitions, chord changes, the detailed stuff that'll make these uplifting moments and things like that. What we want to get here is to get a structure down. And for that, I always create a MIDI channel, because I find these markers that you can set up here, they don't help me really get a mind map of what I'm doing. And let's take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the basic parts. Of course, this is not doctrine. You can structure the tracks any way you like. But in melodic techno, we're club focused, we're DJ DJ focused, and we want to build these tracks in a way that make them work for a live audience. And first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the intro and the outro to kind of ease into this, since this is like these are the simplest parts. And here I have to say my philosophy on the intro and the outro is don't make these parts for the audience, make them for the DJ, because ultimately your track is going to happen in the middle here. And the intro and the outro, if it's just like a solid groove, a basic kick, subs, a little bit of drum action, that's completely enough. And the focus here should be to make it easily mixable. DJ sets are mixes, and we want this track to feature in DJ sets. We want DJs to, want to play this. We want to make DJs' lives harder by introducing like all sorts of craziness in the intro and the outro. Like if you bring a vocal super early, if you have some sort of crazy overdriven melodies like right in the beginning or something like that, then you may catch a DJ off guard. And I mean, in my own DJ career, I have experienced that I have tracks that I really love, but when I'm flipping through what I'm going to play next on one of my sticks, for some tracks I'm like, oh, this is really good, but wasn't there like this weird thing that happens like right at 30 seconds? I mean, obviously you can loop things as a DJ, but you want to make your life as easy as possible. So my philosophy when producing is the intro and the outro is for the DJ, and it's just a wind up, wind down, groove focused. Maybe there's a pad in there, but we want to make it mixable. We want to make this feature easily in the live setting. So all I've done here pretty much in the intro is stacked a bunch of drum channels and just made tiny little adjustments to make sure that the energy is building. This is completely sufficient in my mind. You don't have to get fancy at all. Just these little things like this clap hit that I put in here. And also one trick that I really like is I usually don't start the sub bass right at the beginning of the track, because if you're building a groove, the mind kind of settles into a certain level of pressure. And if the sub bass is like right from the beginning, that's like the default pressure. But if you bring it a little bit later, this part definitely will have enough energy to sustain as a beginning of the track. But then if you can, dump the sub bass into the drum track a little bit later, that just gives another impact that you don't have to manufacture. That's just naturally there. So that's the little thing I really like to do. And then we have this, it's in the synth channel. So we have this channel right here, which just kind of gives us our slightly shuffly information to make sure our drum groove isn't static. And all I've done here is just pull up the automation of the cutoff just a little bit, just to make sure we have a very subtle build that is almost subconscious for the listener, just to make sure we have some sort of progression. But again, I do not spend a lot of time on track intros. I think that same time is much better invested if we actually build the song, I would say. This is a track, but the song part where there's actually melodic information where you can actually make a difference. And getting too fancy in the intro and the outro not only, I think, is wasted effort, it can actually hurt you sometimes in terms of playability. So that's pretty much my thoughts on how you start and how you end. And the outro, since we've introduced a bunch of elements over the course of the track, it can be a bit more complicated than the intro, but again, it's just a wind down drum focused. Again, slowly easing out very subconsciously of the complexity of the drum groove by taking this background pluck that we also introduced in the beginning of the track out very subtly and very slowly. So yeah, basically my thoughts on the intro and the outro. Don't give it too much thought. Make sure the groove is solid. It's mixable. It doesn't have any too crazy surprises in it for the DJ. Yeah, this might sound a little bit close-minded at times, but this is functional music. So you need to make sure the track is functional, is playable, and the intro and the outro don't get too crazy for that reason. All right, then we have split it into basically, this is like the run part I mentioned earlier in the structure, where we basically have the groove that builds over time, and we're repeating this a few times over the track. Here we're kind of in the wind down phase, so we don't have the groove plus M. M stands for melody here. And what I want to do here later on, obviously, we've just like rudimentarily dropped stems in, so it's not super sophisticated yet. But that's why I really like having this channel, because it gives you a mind map of what you're doing. I basically want to have like these mini drops, then have the groove run with more of like these pitch bendy kind of groovy elements, and have basically the whole track focused on the root note of the bass to not have it too busy. And then in this groove plus melody part, we're basically building on top of the groove to build energy, not by, making the elements go crazy, but by adding like chord changes, uplifting feelings through melody. And we're giving ourselves the space to do that by focusing on the groove only and on more the pitch bendy kind of stab sounds, and then being able to open that up later with the melody. So all we've got here is basically the groove with these pitch bendy stabs. And if we move a bit further, this is the first time in the track where we actually want to introduce melody properly. I mean, we've teased it here in this mini break a little bit. But that's just kind of like to set the scene, to have an element not come as a complete surprise. And that's what I like to do sometimes, like take a figure I have already here and then slightly tweak it as a one shot earlier in the track, just to make it a little more homogeneous, the track as a whole, to make sure this doesn't, appear out of nothing, but it's already been teasered at a certain point. And to make it a little bit more, diverse melodically, these one shots, I tend to not use the figures that repeat throughout the track, but just to tweak them slightly, or maybe go into a different key or a different octave, for example. And then we have the break here. Obviously, since we're not working with like pads or risers yet, this is quite empty, but basically we're just kind of phasing out of the different elements we have in the groove section. Just slowly phasing out of all of our sounds. This will be filled with, the very dramatic, uplifting part, which, we don't have in our channels just yet. But that's not the point right now. The point is to get the structure down here. And here we can see we have these very different kind of elements. One of them is like kind of groove focused pitch bendy. The other one is more chordy, and with key changes could be turned into a very like powerful uplifting part. And we're using kind of like call and response here, because these are, in a way, they complement each other, but they're also disparate. So if we play these on top of each other, it'll be very, very busy. All right, and then moving on, here we have the break, and I cut out a little section here because I think a lot of tracks benefit very heavily from having the break like build, peak, but then having like a moment of calm down, like a calm before the storm, where you kind of take out everything. Maybe you focus on a little bit of a crazy sound design element to pique the listener's interest or something like that, because I feel like if you just rise and drop, my experience is just that the impact isn't quite as hard. So I like to have this little downward motion here before we then go into the main groove. And let's just listen to it here. It'll be silence, obviously, but how the drop sounds. Let me talk about my decisions here really quickly. Basically, as I already mentioned previously, I feel like having your most impactful and most sound designy also element appear the first time in the drop is a very powerful decision. I mean, sometimes it can feel out of place, but here I feel like it works. And then the other thing you want to do, if you have, a very commanding element like this that has a lot of energy, a lot of movement in it, then you don't want that movement to be lost, to be buried under a bunch of channels. So we've stripped it down super heavily here. Basically, we've only got the substructure of the basses, the kick, and then this element to make sure it like occupies its own frequency range. It can be maximum power because this is the focal point of our track. This has to hit. So we want this channel right here to do the maximum it can at this point. And one thing that I actually just found in the stems, you know, since this is a full PML project we're working with here, that I really liked was how this interacts with the bass pluck. Let me show you this because I think this is very clever and I'm sure you can use this in your arrangements. So we've basically only got the bass substructure, but I'm only just going to play the pluck here. Very, very nice. Nicely done, in my opinion, because, you know, you have this groove element that's kind of just in the bass, but then we have velocity changes here whenever the lead isn't playing to create this really nice call and response effect. If we listen to it in the context, this is a great way of keeping your arrangements super stripped, but still having a lot of movement in it at the same time. All right, and then let's move on further. Here we have the same idea again, basically. We want to create the maximum amount of space for this super high energy element, but then we want to build on that energy in this next section where we're gonna, you know, add key changes later on, make it really open up. Let's see what that sounds like the way I've just arranged it here. So we've basically got these plucky chords come back in, but then we also have, let's see, where is it here? This background pluck, which kind of gives the track a more airy feel. But if you listen what it would sound like if we play it from the break. I feel like it takes away from the power of this element, so we really want to have like this progression that is stripped, groove focused, powerful, and then we want to open up with the melody. Now, I think this is a structure that works very, very well in melodic techno. It doesn't have to work for every track, but for the elements we have here, I feel like this is the way to go. Because if we just launch all the elements on the drop, it'll be super crowded and they will, you know, get in each other's way, not only in terms of frequency, but also in terms of feeling. So I really like this section or this idea to have strip parts, make your standout element that you defined in the beginning hit super hard, and then open it up with key changes and chords and stuff like that later on. And then we just have this little mini break. I feel like one break is totally sufficient for melodic techno, but just to, you know, keep the energy high, keep it interesting, I like to incorporate another mini break. We'll see what kind of form that takes later on, just to lead into the outro. You know, good arrangement is also management of expectations. On the one hand, it's really important to surprise listeners with like kind of out of the box sounds and crazy twists and things like that. But if it gets too crazy, like it's still dance music. People have to be able to latch onto the groove, to anchor themselves in the groove. And I feel like this little break telegraphs that we're gonna, you know, drop down into just the groovy outro here. And I kind of like having parts in the track that are super surprising than others that telegraph what's going to happen to make sure we still have a very well anchored structure. And I feel like that's what this mini break does here. I've also very slightly here tweaked the main lead, taken down a little bit the cutoff, and also introduced these longer notes just to have sort of a progression to make sure we're not repeating the drop in this mini break. So like just these slight kind of variations, keep it interesting, but also telegraph kind of that we're moving in a certain direction here. All right, now that we have a scaffolding done here, I want to talk a little bit about energy progression, melodic progression. And to me, the crux in this part is staying focused on what you have, keeping your mind on the prize and making sure you're developing the idea that made your initial loop powerful into a powerful track without getting sidetracked. All right, now that we have the core structure down of what our energy flow is going to look like, we have to get the melodic progressions into our energy progression here. And I've added some of the sounds from the bank, basically from the original stems of the track. And all of these elements that we're opening up here, they're all just supporting cast. As I said earlier, stay laser focused, don't start introducing new synths in this process. Everything that you introduce should either be from your original stems or have a very clear goal of, bringing out or supporting one of your main elements. And the main element that we're talking about when we're considering the melodic progression of this track is this pluck right here. So basically what we're working on right now is the melodic progression of this element, and all of these sounds, you can see they're mostly in the break and then also in the mini break later on. They are supposed to give context to this melodic sound to make sure it's as uplifting and as impactful as possible. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about how I rearranged this element here. I showed you earlier how I like to tease elements a little bit with a slightly different figure than, will be repeated throughout the track. But then what we have here in this basically groove plus melody section, where we kind of want to very slowly tease in the melody without taking too much from the groove, because this is still a danceable part. I also think you shouldn't go crazy with the melodies right before the break, because that really takes away from the dynamics of your track, because that's when all of your filters are going to be open, the releases are going to be open, and if you have a barrage of melodies in this part before the break, that'll really hurt the dynamics of the track and also take away from the impact here. So we still have to introduce the element and kind of lead on towards the full chord progression that we'll have in the break and then also later on in the track. So what I've done here basically is space the notes out, and it's basically shifting between the first and second chord of the full chord progression here. Let's see what it sounds like. There's a nice call and response effect going on here. The melodics are being introduced, but it's not super overwhelming and it's still super groovy. What I did do, however, is I introduced this drone down here, which is just a super slight little choir sound. It's not even meant to be audibly perceived, it's just something to glue this very melodic and this kind of, pitch bendy sound together to make sure they don't stand out as their own elements too hard in the track, that we have a little bit more of an organic combination between the two. Yeah, so we've introduced these elements down here to support our main pluck, and what we're basically doing is filling out the frequency spectrum. So we want this to be the uplifting element. This is the progression. We don't want to have 1,000 different melodic elements. We want one, and we want all of these elements to fill out the frequency spectrum with the corresponding root notes to make sure that this can really shine. So let's listen to what that sounds like. One thing maybe before we go into that, just to cool down and to have a contrast between the groove and the break, I've shifted this to the right by a couple of instances, and basically the supporting substructure of this element is kind of, it doesn't have any mids, it's kind of the very lows and the very highs, and that's supposed to, give more dynamic range to when this hits that it actually has impact. So in general, when you're doing energetic progressions, it usually makes sense to, pair high impact parts with a low impact lead up to make sure you have that contrast so your elements hit when they come in. So just phasing out the drums here. And here we have the substructure playing the root notes of our progression here. Opening up. Also introduced a riser here, melodic riser. So that's basically our build-up, and it is very one-dimensional, but that's also by design. We want this element to carry it, and all of these are basically following along, filling out the frequency spectrum to make sure it is broadband, it is impactful and uplifting. And now I want to move on to this little section. One trick that I really like when I'm building breaks is to make a variation of the core energy element, basically our main lead here, and to have that sit alone in its own space to make sure the full range of its sound design, and its modulation really can cut through. And I've basically just taken this element, made a different figure to it, and automated it a little bit to create kind of like a sound designy special lead up effect. This kind of uses a different notation than the rest of the track. It's kind of on half time, and that's a little bit by design here. You want this to kind of stand out from the rest of the track. So maybe also triplets could work really well if you're designing an element like this. And as I said a little bit earlier, I really think it's a really good decision in arrangement to basically present your main element on a platter. And here, can't get much more focused than this, to have absolute silence and then the element soloing apart, basically. All right. Then in terms of our melodic progression, we added no melodies in this part. This is the groove, the part of the track that should hit the hardest, that should be extremely danceable, that should be extremely club focused. And I feel like introducing any form of melody underneath this main lead just takes away from its power. So I basically keeping this super stripped in this part, and then the pluck really opens up in the groove plus melody section. I'm actually not completely happy with how this leads into the melody part. It's kind of abrupt, but in this section, we're working on our melodic progression, so you can always do the details later. And that's basically what I mean when I say you have to be rigorous in your arrangements, because you always have to have the clear job you're trying to do in the back of your mind. Otherwise, it's so easy to get sidetracked. And then finally, I just want to talk about this last break here. This is a kind of an uncommon break, I would say, and I want to talk about why. First of all, we have, the full bass channels are basically active throughout the entire break. And that is because, this is not a peaky break. It's supposed to telegraph that we're going to go, low. We're going to go into the outro of the track. So you don't want like that massive peak like you have in the main break. You kind of want like that auto filter break where basically the drums are still active and you're telegraphing, okay, this is the downward trajectory in the beat. It's still groovy, but we're heading toward the outro. All right, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about is the bass notation here. we've corresponding to, or basically every time we play the full chords here from our progression, we're also gonna vary the root notes of the bass channels. And I think this is super impactful, especially if you have a standing note for a long period of time. If you play the C sharp for a really long time, then you create this kind of mantra within the track. You know, listeners will be like super focused on that C, live in that note basically. And then changing the root note of the bass is much more impactful if you've run a single note for a really long time. And I think the way it's built up here is super impactful because, you know, the rolling bass for the first time changes notes at 3.5 minutes. Let's just listen to what that sounds like. This is so much more impactful than if you'd had note changes in the rolling bass from the very beginning. And this also really works with our structure where we have parts that are supposed to be super groove focused, not melodic at all, and then others where you want to keep that grooviness but just up it by a melodic component. And I think working like this really works. I would strongly advise to, you know, stay in your root note for most of the time, and then when you really want a part to pop but still be groovy, then shift into different notes for your bass patterns. Okay, we've built a lot of our elements and our basic scaffolding. Now it's kind of a little bit into the details, how to make elements intro and exit organically, how to make sure, you know, you have dynamics in your track without having to make it too crazy, too busy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about techniques that help you introduce dynamics without, you know, doing too much channel stacking, and also how to use resampling, for example, to intro and outro your elements smoothly and organically while still staying in that arrangement mode, without having to go back to the drawing board and, you know, introduce new synthesizers. Now that we have our basic progression down, our melodic progression down, you might have noticed that we haven't used any effects like risers, crashes, impacts. And I firmly believe in leaving that to be the very last step in my arrangement process. I feel like if you introduce risers and crashes and impacts early, what happens is you're using them as crutches basically for energy, you know? Like, it's super easy to have like a fat kick and a really nice impact on top of it, and you're like, holy shit, this is super groovy, you know? But actually, you know, the substance isn't really there. Like, an impact will always sound like gigantic. And I feel like I just personally do worse getting the most out of the energetic and melodic progression of my elements if I have risers in the track already. You know, I'll much quicker say, oh, this is, you know, this is the energy level I need. At one point I just decided, okay, all of these extra things that build and recede energy, I'll leave that to the very, very end. So I'm sure that I'm not using any crutches when I'm building my melodic progression. And that also makes, you know, once you introduce them at the end, that's always such a rewarding process because everything hits so much harder. Before we get to that step, I want to talk about a couple of tricks I use sometimes to make sure, you know, that my arrangement isn't static, especially if I have like these groove parts where not too much is happening. And also what techniques I usually use to make sure my elements don't statically just burst into the track, but that there's some sort of lead up to them that's super subtle and also kind of interesting. I think one point that makes sense here to look at is the first time this melody comes in. Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. This works, you know, but I feel like it could be cool to have a lead up to this sound, especially for the first time it's introduced. So what I like to do is resample it basically. So we're going to open up a new audio track. We're going to route the pluck to it. Here we go. In and arm it. And then we are going to basically affect this track heavily. So I'm going to say you can use grain delays for this. You can use, you know, basically, or resonators, you know, whatever effect units you like to use. Usually I'm just going to use a filter delay here, I think. Let's see what we have. I set the feedback to high, dry to low, and maybe let's have like very quick or a combination of different tempos here. And maybe let's just go an octave up for this, and then we're just gonna hit record. Okay, let's wait for it to die down. All right, that should be enough. Okay, let's go back to auto here, and I'm just gonna reverse this, and then I'm just gonna double the length, and let's just see what we have like right off the bat. Maybe pull down the gain a little bit. That choppy effect is coming from the beats mode. I kind of like it actually, but we can see what it sounds like in complex. I'm going to pitch it up here as well, go back to beats, and now we're just basically going to affect this track and see if we can get like a nice lead up here that's organic and that's also based on our original sound, so it doesn't like muddy the waters, doesn't take away from our sound aesthetic. So let's filter it a little bit. I'm going to quantize here just to make sure it's not too erratic. Alright, and then let's go for a reverb on top of that. Obviously we have to remove the filter delay again. Forgot about that. Take the pitch back down. I kind of like this start of the sound, so what if we just try this and then just drag it a little bit to see what that yields. All right, maybe like this. And let's just have it fade in a little bit. Alright, I quite like it. I just think it maybe is just a little bit too loud still. And then also, I think we need to get something on the tail end of this. Maybe turn it down by 4, and then make sure it's somehow mirrored after the fact. This part of it. This, and then let's turn up the decay. Maybe take the tail end of this and turn it up. And then finally, we're gonna filter it out here. And we can just consolidate. All right, not perfect, but I just wanted to illustrate the point here. You can do this with drums even, if you have like a drum figure at some point, just resample it and have like those crazy repetitions by reversing it, by testing out the beats mode, by dragging the sample, making it shorter, making it longer, and trying out these different modes in the warp area. And I feel like this is a super powerful tool to just have these really left field ways of fading in your sounds that are really close to your original sound. So you're not making it busy, everything's staying organic and homogeneous. And I usually go through, my tracks when I'm at this point. I have the energetic progression, I have the melodic progression, and then I'll just, instead of introducing tons of, channels that run throughout, I'll just resample particular channels, put some sort of effect on it, try to make like a supporting channel for it just to give it that additional layer and to make sure everything fades in and fades out really nicely. One more thing I wanted to highlight is, as I said in the beginning, I feel like a lot of people do too much in arrangement. And often I think that's due to the fact that if you have these, especially these parts where the groove only is running, that you have the feeling everything is too static, not enough is happening. And of course, for club focused music, that's like one of the worst feelings you can have. It's like, oh God, this is like just lacks dynamics so much and it like isn't really moving. The energy isn't really moving up and down. And then people, add in elements all the time, take them out, that it gets super busy and super convoluted. And I mean, probably take a look at your favorite club tracks. I'm gonna venture a guess that they're more on the simple side and they really effectively deliver one idea. And yeah, that's for me a really important part of the arrangement, is to not make it too busy and still, avoid being very static when you have those parts where not too much is happening. And to combat that a little bit, I have a few things that I sometimes do to make sure that a static groove, there's some movement in it without having to introduce or exit elements all the time. And I'm just gonna take as an example this background pluck sound. I mean, there's some movement here. There's also a little bit of automation, but that's like, there's not too much happening to really make it dynamically move. But a couple of things you can do here is just kind of make sure that the sound morphs over time. And I like to use erosion for that sometimes. So we're just going to drop an erosion into it. And then if you have Max for Live, or if you have access to another LFO, you can drop an LFO in here and then just map a couple of parameters. And we're going to take the rate way down, and we're also going to adjust the range super heavily. We don't want these effects to be pronounced. We're just trying to introduce like some sort of, almost on a subconscious level, movement. And then let's also map the frequency, but more in the higher range, I would say, since it's a percussive element. And you'll want to place these, before you're EQing. And to bring that out a little bit more, you can also add other effects, perhaps a little overdrive. You can map the drive and the dry wet. I guess we can't actually map this, but we can still map the tone. A good idea here would maybe be to turn around some of the settings so they don't all move in the same direction. Maybe a bit lower rates. Yeah, while this might not be super obvious when we just listen to it A-B right now, it introduces movement, like super subtle micro shifting little movements into your static channels. You're going to want to use this on the channels that run through most of the track to make sure there's just a little bit more organic movement, a little bit more neurologically to process. You have these little micro shifts where, you know, your hearing is constantly on a very low level, focusing on tiny changes, on new things. And that just helps your track breathe much more, especially in these longer groove sections. Perhaps if we take down the frequency by a lot. Yeah, and these kind of things, they just make sure, you know, there's movement without you having to automate tons of things. You know, just these little micro shifts. This was just like a quick little thing I threw together here. But if you take a little bit of time to automate these things on the proper channels, you'll get like a whole new depth in movement that doesn't require all of these shifts or all of these changes in the arrangement that in the end make it super busy and, you know, convoluted. All right, one more thing that kind of goes into the same direction is a super simple little trick. If you just throw an auto filter into a channel, take up the LFO, and then maybe go against the grain of your track. So maybe if you pick 3/16ths. So what it's doing basically is it's moving the auto filter back and forth with the rate of 3/16ths, which just introduces, you know, it doesn't destroy our groove at all. It's still like super pumping, but it just introduces this new complexity to the groove as the frequencies of this background pluck drift in and out. I don't feel like this track really needs that much micro shift. There's enough going on, but I think this is a super powerful trick. You can hear it here already in the channel. There's so much movement now and so much modulation with just, you know, a few very, very simple effects and a few very, very simple knobs that we hit. So I think this is really great, especially if you have long running parts that you feel are too static and, you know, you don't want to risk overloading your track. All right, now that we have our scaffolding done, we have an energy progression, we have a melodic progression. I like to leave this this next part for the very last step, which is like impacts and crashes. A lot of people introduce that too early, I feel like, and that's kind of like a crutch. I think it's better to have a process where you're trying to get everything energetically and melodically you can out of your element before introducing these energetic crutches like crashes and risers. Don't get me wrong, really important effects and really important to have them to really have these moments that deliver in the live setting, but introduce them at a later stage to make sure you're not tricking yourself and you're getting the most out of your core elements that carry the track. We have arrived at the last leg now of our arrangement journey here. We've identified the core elements at the beginning that we wanted to highlight. We built a very basic structure. We made sure our melodic progression works, and we did all of that without the crutches of impacts and risers to make sure we get our energy out of our elements organically and don't have to manufacture them on top, which I think is a super important thing because it's so easy to trick yourself into, wow, this is sick, when actually it's just a hit from the, industrial impacts pack or something. And we also, in the previous section, I talked a little bit about what you can do if your groove is too static, and what you can do to avoid going crazy in the arrangement, and also how to organically lead in sounds. I actually quite like how this turned out. The example that I did here, this channel right here, super nice. I've actually repeated it up here. Let's see what it sounds like here. Yeah, super nice, chill transitional element that really gels, that we got really easily from playing with, affecting this channel right here. And I think a really good example of how you can really have organic transitional elements that come from your core channels. And this way, the risk is also much lower that you meander off when you should be actually arranging your tracks into, sound design or into building new synthesizers or whatever. All right, but I really quickly want to check out the FX section. I mean, FX basically, you know how it goes. Basically, everyone drops effects into their tracks and it's usually drag and drop. There's not too much to it, but there are a few things I want to highlight. One thing is that I think you need to really think about where and when you use impacts and FX and white noise. And I wanted to highlight, I think, the part here where the snare comes in, which I think is really nice. This is a very white noisy snare, so it was pretty easy to find a nice white noise to, announce it, quote unquote. And what happens when you pick two sounds, or when you introduce a sound with another sound out of the same sound family, you get this much nicer effect because, the tail of the FX really bleeds into the sound that you're introducing. So let's just listen to it really quickly here. So this FX, the tail of this FX basically bleeds into the snare that it's introducing. And I feel like, that's just such a smooth, subtle effect if you just, pick these impacts that are from the same sound family as, the sound it's kind of announcing in that moment. Yeah, and another point I wanted to highlight are these impacts that are kind of nice because these are what I was talking about earlier. If you have groove-only sections, it's hard to keep it interesting sometimes. You can increase the movement of a channel, like I highlighted earlier, but I think these impacts are also really nice here. I mean, not impact, more like one shot, but basically these kind of heavily affected sounds that stem more from sound design than from melodics. And I think these work really nicely to give, movement and color and energy to these groove sections where, you're not relying on melodies too much. All right, then let's just listen to a little bit to what the impacts are doing here. So we have three impacts at this point, pretty early in the track, but I think it's like a figure by itself. It's almost like a drum fill, you've got like the inhale, then you've got kind of a transient sucking in and out motion, and then you've got the exhale, the psh, And I think layering sounds like this, like not on top of each other, but basically leading up to one another is really nice in FX, and I don't see it used too much. So maybe that's something to look out for. Basically, your FX sections should always follow the trajectory of the track. So here, the track is diving, it's heading down into the lower part of the break. So we've got a closing white noise section here that kind of builds or adds to that feeling. And from here, there's not too much going on with FX until we hit like the high energy part of the break. So I'm just going to skip up there. We've layered the sine-based riser with a more modulated one here. This is a pretty good point to illustrate what I wanted to say about, doing the FX last, first of all, because I really like this effect in this channel. I guess at some point I felt like at this moment in this channel, there was like a lack of energy on the one. And, if I had put a crash there or whatever, or some sort of impact earlier on in the track, then I wouldn't have gotten this effect, which kind of organically out of the synthesizer produces its own impact, which I think, harmonizes much nicer than if it was just an impact. This is our FX sound from the beginning, again leading into this bridge. And then we have our melodic part here, and I just wanted to play the mini break for you as our last official order of business here. Again, we're dropping down into the break. And from here, it's just groove till the end. Again, this part, we're just letting it run its course. This is where the magic is. This is where our time should be spent. All right, great. That concludes the arrangement part of our course here. I would say maybe I'll try to summarize it quickly. Intro and outro, we do not care. Or we do care, but, we do this quick and dirty. This is groove focused. This is no fancy footwork. This is for the DJ. This is to make it functional, playable, and groovy and nothing else. Like all your musicianship is focused on this mid part here. And then the other super important thing is to stay laser focused. Don't deviate, from your steps in the arrangement process. I know it's hard sometimes for a lot of people, me included. It's just much more fun to jam and come up with stuff, than to have this like very stringent kind of organized process of finishing a track. But I feel like, if you develop your own sequence, your own steps that work for you, and you stick to that, then basically I think you can become an absolute track machine. Track finishing machine. And one other thing that might also be different for everyone, but I've just discovered that for myself, is when I arrange for days, it just never gets good. Basically what I do now is I arrange in one day, and if I don't like the arrangement after that, I don't try to fix it. I just redo it. I just maybe recreate a couple of the things that I know worked for me the first time around, then I try something else for the other stems. Whether that translates for everyone listening, I don't know. But yeah, basically I think arrangement is about coming up with your own process and then rigorously sticking to that process. All right. Thank you so much. This has been Dahu with PML, and I hope you got something out of it, and I'm excited to hear everyone's tracks. Arrangement is one of the toughest parts of the production process. And I think the way to success will be kind of a little bit different for everyone. But one key thing is, to develop your own arrangement process and then to stick to it. Maybe, if something doesn't work for you, you can modify it over time. But for me, the most important thing is to be rigorous, to stay in that mode of I'm finishing this. I am not going to go back to the drawing board. I'm not going to, let my ideas run completely wild. Of course, if you have a great idea, run with it, but stay in the finisher mode. I would say that was core to me in my process, and I suspect that will be core to very many people to get that down, to kind of be disciplined with yourself in this process. My arrangement philosophy is also stick to your guns, commit to the things you have. You made the decision in the beginning to finish this track. There's something about it you like that warrants finishing it. So don't let those emotions that come in during the process where you're like, is this really good enough? Don't get sidetracked by that. Commit to your elements and finish it the way it is. If you don't like the end result, you can always scrap it and try again. But I think just this focus is the most important thing I want to share with everyone listening. All right. Thank you everyone so much for listening. This has been Dahu for PML, and I hope this was useful and gets you that much closer to putting out finished products that have, your handwriting all over them.